At 38, Eliza Wren was homeless, publicly shamed, and down to $4.35. Thaddeus Kincaid, the banker who held half of Mercy Crossing in his ledger-colored hands, had cast her out after accusing her of stealing from the town's widows' grain fund, and hungry people who once trusted her had let the accusation harden into truth because fear will often accept the first lie that explains an empty shelf. She had one carpetbag with 2 dresses, a skillet black as winter bark, her mother's sewing shears, and those $4.35 folded in the lining of her glove. With 3 of those dollars, in a sheriff's auction held behind the feed store on a blinding afternoon in western Kansas, she bought an old abandoned barn leaning beyond the cottonwoods at the edge of town, and the men who watched the sale laughed as if they were witnessing the last foolish act of a ruined woman. Yet beneath that sagging hayloft, behind rot, dust, and the smell of old summers, something had been sealed away for years, something that would alter her life and return a stolen future to the very people who had turned their backs on her. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Eliza Wren. If you are watching from a place others have forgotten, tell us where in the comments, because forgotten places sometimes keep the truest stories. Mercy Crossing had been one of those high plains towns that looked, from a distance, like a handful of stubborn boards dropped into a sea of grass by a careful and hopeful hand. In spring, the buffalo grass silvered under the wind as if the earth were thinking. In summer, the roads whitened and rang beneath wagon wheels. In winter, the northers came down hard enough to scour paint from doors and leave the water pails frozen in their iron hoops. It was not a grand place, not even by the loose frontier standards that permitted men to boast of crossroads as cities, but it had a church with a bell cast in St. Louis, a schoolhouse with 6 narrow windows, a blacksmith with a patient hammer, a telegraph office that clicked like a hidden insect, and a stock tank where children sailed bark boats after the rains. Eliza had been born in a room above her father's wheelwright shop, when the town was still new enough for every building to smell of fresh-cut pine and wet lime. Her father, Jonas Wren, could set a wagon wheel true by eye and keep the accounts of 3 different ranchers in the same neat hand without once crossing a figure. And her mother, Ruth, stitched, doctored, and comforted with the tireless composure of women whose tenderness has been sharpened by necessity rather than softened by ease. From her father, Eliza learned that most troubles begin when a man stops measuring carefully. From her mother, she learned that most troubles endure because no one is willing to bend down and mend what another person calls too far gone. As a girl, she had loved the shop more than the parlor, loved the smell of shavings and axle grease, of sun-warmed leather and grain dust, loved the straight certainty of tools laid where they belonged and columns of numbers that, if treated honestly, would always tell on a liar sooner or later. Jonas Wren taught her to add by lamplight with kernels of corn, to read deeds and receipts before she was tall enough to reach the higher shelf, to listen for loose boards and hidden leaks and any small complaint in a structure that, left unheard, would become a ruin by winter. When customers came in flustered and proud, cursing a bent rim or a broken singletree as though the object had insulted them on purpose, Jonas would only smile, turn the damaged thing in his hands, and say that wood remembers the shape it once wanted to hold if a patient person gives it the chance. Eliza heard that sentence so often that it became, though she did not know it then, the private scripture of her life. Ruth taught her different but neighboring lessons. She taught her how to patch a sleeve so the mend lay stronger than the cloth around it, how to carry coffee into a room of grieving people without making their grief feel observed, how to judge weather in the smell of the air before sunrise, and how to keep a face calm while her mind was still doing all the necessary worrying. They were not wealthy people, but theirs was a household of plain dignity, the kind held together by scrubbed floors, honest labor, and the quiet refusal to waste what still had use. When Eliza was 12, Mercy Crossing suffered a grasshopper year that stripped kitchen gardens to lace and left cattle nosing dry creek beds for something green to trust. Folks who had spent the previous spring boasting of their new paint and eastbound catalog orders found themselves boiling coffee thinner, bartering seed, and learning humility from the sound of empty feed bins. Jonas and Ruth did what such people do when hardship stops being a story from somewhere else and arrives with dust on its boots. They opened what they had. The shop became a place where harnesses were repaired on promise, not payment, and Ruth's table never lacked for one more bowl no matter how little was in the pot. Eliza watched her parents save families not with miracles but with arithmetic and steadiness, with an ounce spared here, an entry kept straight there, a few pounds of flour advanced to a widow because decency makes its own ledger and expects payment only in survival. In that hard year, she learned another thing that stayed with her long after childhood had gone. A community is built less by triumph than by the memory of who stood near when the weather turned. Mercy Crossing survived, and the next season softened, and prosperity, when it returned, did what prosperity often does. It made many people forget the hands that had kept them from falling. By the time Eliza reached womanhood, she had a reputation for reliability so complete that it was almost mistaken for plainness. People brought their invoices to her to read, their letters to her to answer, their dispute over fence line measurements to her to settle, because she understood numbers and could keep her temper when other people lost theirs. She never married, though proposals had been made in the thoughtless, practical way frontier proposals sometimes were. Half about companionship and half about whether a woman would combine well with a parcel of land and a set of chores. Her heart was not frozen, as some said, only occupied by duty and by a seriousness of temperament that made her cherish usefulness more than display. After Ruth died of a fever taken from nursing a ranch hand through winter, and after Jonas followed 3 years later with his lungs spent from dust and age, Eliza inherited the narrow house beside the shop and the work that seemed always to find her. She kept books for the grain cooperative, copied inventories for merchants whose own penmanship sagged into mystery, and took in 2 boarders, a schoolteacher and a widowed seamstress, who paid enough to help with taxes and coal. She had no illusions about grandeur. She wanted only enough constancy to keep a roof sound, debts paid, and her name untroubled. Yet in small towns, as we know, a good name is not a possession one keeps by locking it away. It remains in the mouths of others, and if the wrong mouth takes hold of it, even years of decency can be worried apart in a season. The first bad turn came with the long, dry months, then the rail slowdown, then the panic that reached out from eastern banks like an invisible blight and found even far western towns standing in the sudden cold of vanished credit. Prices for grain fell through the floorboards. Men who had borrowed against next year's harvest began selling off next month's hope. Merchants narrowed their eyes over unpaid accounts. Wagons left town lighter than they arrived. That was when Thaddeus Kincaid grew taller in local esteem, though not in character. He had come to Mercy Crossing as a young clerk years earlier with polished boots, controlled speech, and the kind of patience that can wait a decade for profit without ever once being mistaken for kindness. He bought the bank from a founder's son who drank too much and studied too little, married no one, attached himself to every committee that handled money, and by degrees became the man whose nod was taken for prudence and whose refusal was treated as law. He spoke often of discipline, of order, of keeping sentiment from interfering with good business, and many who suffered under him still admired the clean cuffs with which he delivered their suffering. Eliza had never liked him, though she had dealt with him often enough when entering cooperative deposits and requesting small advances for seed purchases. There was in him a dry contempt for people who needed one another, and a satisfaction in paperwork that was not the honest satisfaction of exactitude but the colder pleasure of control. When the drought deepened and the cooperative began stretching its reserves to feed widows, children, and men who had not yet admitted their own need, Eliza kept the distribution ledger. It was plain work, necessary work, and she did it with the old rigor of her father's shop, recording every sack issued, every note signed, every promise made against the next cutting, branding season, or remittance from distant kin. Then, one raw morning after a week of dust-laden wind, Thaddeus Kincaid called for an inspection. He arrived at the storeroom with 2 town councilmen, the sheriff, and a look of solemn injury, as if he had been personally betrayed by the world's untidiness. The ledger showed shortages. 3 pages were missing. Receipts did not match cash on hand. A line of credit opened for the widow's fund had been drawn down further than the surviving pages could justify. Eliza knew at once that something had been altered, because her books had never once gone wandering under her hand. But knowledge is one thing and proof another, and proof had a way of disappearing whenever Kincaid stood nearby. She said the entries had been tampered with. He said such a claim was convenient. She asked for time. He told the room that time is what thieves request when they hope a pitying town will grow uncertain. The accusation spread faster than rainwater under a sill. Some defended her at first, but hunger erodes loyalty by small daily bites. Mothers who had once thanked her for seeing them through winter began counting aloud the sacks they believed had been lost. Men whose notes lay unpaid at Kincaid's bank did not wish to quarrel with the man who held the paper that could strip them bare. The boarders left quietly because scandal is expensive to share. The town council suspended her from the cooperative, then asked for her house as security until the losses were repaid. Eliza argued, produced duplicate receipts, pointed out inconsistencies in the bank's own statements, but Kincaid had prepared the ground too carefully. A deputy came with stamped papers. Her father's shop, already weakened by unpaid accounts and a year of reduced trade, was attached to the debt. Her small savings went to taxes and legal filings that changed nothing. She sold the walnut table her mother had polished every Saturday, then the extra stove, then her good Sunday cloak. For a while she managed on spite and order, as certain women do, keeping her chin lifted even while the boards beneath her narrowed one by one. But contempt has its own power in a small town, and Mercy Crossing had begun to look at her as if misfortune were catching. The true cruelty came not in the paperwork, though paperwork can be merciless enough, but in the social turning away. Women on the boardwalk fell suddenly interested in their parcels when she approached. Men who had once tipped their hats kept them on. Children, hearing more than adults ever guess, whispered that Miss Wren had stolen flour from babies. At church, the pew behind her remained empty though the room was crowded. Kincaid, with that measured, sorrowful tone men use when they wish to appear burdened by another person's moral failing, told anyone who asked that he took no pleasure in firmness, but Mercy Crossing could not survive if sentiment excused dishonesty. He said it often enough that people repeated it as if it had always been their own belief. Eliza endured all this with a face that seemed carved from winter pear wood, but every evening in the little house that no longer truly belonged to her, she sat by the lamp and laid out her surviving receipts and notes in careful rows, chasing the missing path through them like a traveler tracing a vanished road on an old map. She knew the widow's fund had not simply dissolved. Money had moved. Grain had gone somewhere. Lines had been removed because someone feared what would happen if they remained together long enough to speak. In late August, with the sky white and pitiless and the cottonwoods along the dry creek rattling like old bones, the sheriff posted the final notice. She had 3 days to leave. On the second of those days, the schoolteacher who had once boarded with her sent over a basket of biscuits and did not come in. On the third, Eliza loaded her carpet bag, skillet, shears, blankets, and 1 box of papers onto a borrowed handcart, locked the house for the last time, and left the key with the deputy because dignity, when all else is taken, will often survive in the performance of exact procedure. She had $7.35 when the sale of her last pieces was done. The rest went before noon to satisfy fees, interest, and some final invented balance that Kincaid's clerk produced without looking ashamed. That left her $4.35, the money in her glove lining, and nowhere in town willing to let her stay without demanding the kind of gratitude that feels too much like humiliation to bear. She walked past the livery, past the shuttered bakery, past her own former gate, and out toward the sheriff's auction yard because word had spread that unsold properties and scrap improvements would be offered for almost nothing. She told herself she was only looking for salvageable boards. Perhaps that was partly true. But there was also, working beneath her thoughts, the old instinct Eliza Wren had given her. If a thing has been discarded too quickly, examine who profited from the haste. The barn stood at the far edge of the lots, listed not as a dwelling, but as an improvement on a parcel already stripped from a dead rancher's estate and divided in the bank's files into future claims. Once it had belonged to Ezekiel Talbot, one of Mercy Crossing's earliest settlers, a man remembered mostly for a laugh that carried over fields, and for the broad draft horses he had raised before a crushed chest and a bad winter finished him. The house on the parcel had burned years before, and the remaining land, never prime enough to interest buyers while better acreage remained, had been left to weed, wind, and speculation. Only the barn survived, silvered and leaning, its roofline bent like an old shoulder, its loft door hanging crooked above a tangle of dock and burrs. Boys used it for daring one another. Men used it as an example in conversation whenever they wanted to illustrate failure. Eliza looked at it differently. Old barns were honest about their wounds. They listed where the footings had sunk, showed plainly which boards had warped, admitted every season they had endured in nail rust and weather marks. A foolish purchase, yes, but a structure at least, a place with walls, shade, and enough lumber to shelter a person who knew how to coax use from neglect. When bidding opened, no one wanted it. Someone called out 50 cents as a joke. The sheriff, sweating beneath his hat, asked for more. Eliza heard her own voice say $3 before prudence could stop it. Laughter rolled through the yard, then sharpened when no one answered. The hammer came down. For $3, the ruined woman bought the ruin. She walked to the barn that evening with $1.35 left, her handcart squeaking over ruts, the whole sky burning copper above the grasslands while swallows turned and stitched the air with dark, quick arcs. Up close, the building smelled of old hay, mice, sun-baked resin, and those deep, sweet traces left by horses long absent. One lower window was gone, but she could cover it. The tack room still had a door that latched. The roof sagged but held. Someone had left half a broken rake, 2 rusted hinges, and a feed scoop with its handle split clean down the middle. To many eyes, it would have looked like an apology for shelter. To Eliza, exhausted enough to value walls over pride, it looked almost luxurious. She swept out the tack room, stuffed cracks with sacking, set her skillet and blankets in one corner, and stood in the center while dusk thickened around the beams. There are moments in a life when humiliation and freedom arrive together in such tangled form that it is impossible to tell one from the other. Nobody could now throw her out of this place without another public act. Nobody could lower a voice and say she had overstayed charity. She had spent nearly all she possessed on a barn people mocked, but for the first time in weeks the space around her belonged, however precariously, to her own choosing. The next morning she began the work that steadied her mind whenever grief or fury threatened to turn it loose. She cleaned, she sorted, she studied. Dust rose around her in pale sheets where sunlight pierced the slats. Rats had long since moved to some wiser address, leaving only husks, droppings, and dry-chewed corners. The lower stalls had been stripped years earlier, yet the craftsmanship remained in the joinery. Talbot had built sturdily, pegging corners that another man would have trusted to nails. On the north wall she found notches marking horse heights, each year cut with a pocket knife, and labeled in a hand surprisingly fine for a cattleman. On a beam near the loft ladder she found a small branded symbol, a swallow within a circle, burned shallowly into the wood. She knew the mark at once, though she had not seen it in years. Eliza Wren had once repaired a surveyor's field chest bearing the same device, and told her it belonged to the First Mercy Crossing Cooperative, a hopeful arrangement the founders had made before the bank grew powerful, a promise that certain water rights and emergency reserves would be held in common for the town's survival. The cooperative had failed, people said, because settlers are poor at long agreement and rich in immediate need. Yet Jonas had said it in a different tone, as if failure were not the whole story. That afternoon, while dragging a fork through the haymold and collapsed fodder under the loft, Eliza heard a sound that did not belong to loose litter or ordinary plank. Beneath the rake's rasp came a dense, tucked-away knock, not earth, not beam, but space. She stopped, listened, and scraped again. Hollow. The sensation that ran through her then was not greed, not even hope exactly, but recognition, the old craftsman's alertness that rises when a surface tells you it is hiding more than weather. She climbed the loft ladder carefully, each rung protesting beneath her weight, and entered a dim chamber fragrant with dry grass, dust, and years of forgotten summer. The hayloft floor was layered in brittle straw and mouse nests. Light came in slanted bars through the warped siding, drawing gold lines across the gloom. Near the center, where the flooring was more heavily packed, she found the echo again. Kneeling, she brushed aside hay with both hands until her fingers met a narrow iron ring flush set between planks, so thick with dirt it had nearly become wood-colored. Her pulse steadied rather than raced. That, too, was a Wren trait. Excitement made some people wild. It made her careful. She worked the ring loose with the split feed scoop, pried up one board, then another, revealing not an open cellar but a fitted wooden hatch sealed at the edges with tar long gone brittle. Wedged beneath it lay an oilcloth packet no bigger than a Bible. Inside the packet was a brass key, dark with age, and a folded scrap of paper written in faded brown ink. The hand was older-fashioned than her own, deliberate and spare. Most of the words had blurred, but one line remained legible enough to make the loft seem suddenly colder despite the heat. If the town forgets whose water saved it, let the loft remember. Beneath that line was the swallow mark. No name. No instruction beyond memory itself. Eliza sat back on her heels, hay seeds clinging to her skirt, and listened to the barn breathe around her. Outside, cicadas wound up in the grass. Somewhere a wagon traveled the far road, its axles ticking. Under her hands lay a hatch sealed by someone who had feared discovery and trusted time. In her lap rested a key that might fit a lock below, or elsewhere, or nowhere at all. She could have told herself it was only an old settler's melodrama, a farmer's hidden whiskey cache, a packet of family trifles with no more power than sentiment. Yet the words about water, the swallow mark, the care with which the space had been concealed, all touched the same part of her mind where the missing pages of the widow's ledger had lived these past months. Things vanish when someone wants memory altered. Things are hidden when truth must wait for a braver season. She did not open the hatch that day. Instead, she replaced the boards, tucked the key inside her bodice, and spent the evening reading over what she already knew, because impulse had never served her half so well as preparation. Mercy Crossing had nearly failed once before, in its earliest drought years, and old-timers still spoke in scraps of how a spring west of town and some emergency stores had carried them through. The details had blurred under newer troubles. The land near that spring now sat in parcels held, leased, or claimed through Kincaid's bank. The widow's fund shortages had begun around the same time he started pressing hardest on those parcels. Could the hidden place in the hayloft hold proof of some older arrangement that men like Kincaid preferred forgotten? Could it hold nothing at all but disappointments wrapped in old paper? She slept badly on her blanket, waking to every creak of the barn, to moonlight across the wall, to the sound of wind nosing under the eaves. By dawn, caution had settled into resolve. Whatever lay under the loft was not safer left to rot, and if Eliza Wren had only ever moved when certainty was guaranteed, she would have lived a smaller life than the one hardship had already forced upon her. The hatch, once the tarred seams were worked loose and the boards levered back, opened not into earth but into a narrow crawlspace fitted between the loft flooring and a false ceiling built above the old grain room below. Talbot had made, in effect, a hidden chamber suspended within the barn itself, inaccessible unless a person knew precisely where to pry. The craftsmanship astonished her. 2 joists had been boxed to create a shallow compartment running nearly 8 feet long, dry as a drawer despite all the years, protected from rats by tin flashing, and from casual discovery by the weight of hay once piled over it. Inside stood a cedar chest bound in blackened iron, 3 canvas cylinders, a wrapped bundle of books, and a small metal strongbox whose lock matched the brass key. Dust lay everywhere except on the keyhole itself, and that little absence made her wonder whether another hand had opened it long ago and resealed it, or whether dust simply settles unevenly where secrets are concerned. She turned the key. The lock resisted, then yielded with a sound like an old throat clearing. Within the strongbox lay papers layered in oilskin, a velvet pouch of coins, and letters tied with blue ribbon gone gray. Eliza lifted the top packet and found a ledger headed Mercy Crossing Common Reserve, established 1871. The pages, though brittle at the corners, remained readable. Contributions were listed from settlers she had known only as surnames on graves and lots: Talbot, Henshaw, DeLuca, Pike, Wren, Baptiste, Ortega. Beside each were entries of labor, seed, livestock, cash, and, most startling of all, notes regarding a town reserve created not merely for charity but for the preservation of shared water access, school upkeep, emergency grain distribution, and widow protection in years of severe loss. Tucked among these pages were certificates for rail shares and government bonds purchased in the reserve's name when cattle prices had once run high. Most had matured years earlier. There were bank receipts from Dodge City and Denver, endorsements never collected, and a schedule of interest written in the meticulous hand of someone who understood that the future often survives only if written down with more care than the present thinks necessary. This alone would have been remarkable enough. But beneath those financial papers lay the true blade hidden in the sheath. It was a rolled survey map, sealed with the swallow mark, showing the original town plat and the western spring, not as privately parceled land but as common right, protected by a covenant signed by the founders and witnessed by the territorial surveyor. The covenant granted perpetual access to water for household use, livestock in drought, and irrigation for the small kitchen strips of widows and families in emergency seasons. Attached to it was a set of affidavits written several years later by Ezekiel Talbot and the first schoolteacher, Miriam Voss, declaring that a younger Thaddeus Kincaid, then only a clerk assisting the bank, had attempted to transfer sections of the common reserve into debt instruments tied to individual mortgages. The effort had been stopped for the time being, but the affidavits stated plainly that if the originals held at the courthouse ever vanished or were altered, the duplicate proofs and reserve records hidden in the Talbot barn were to be delivered to a state judge in Topeka, or, failing that, placed before the whole town. There were more letters, and they widened the story further. Miriam Voss, who wrote with firm strokes and no patience for evasions, explained in one that several founders feared the bank would swallow the reserve after a spate of deaths and departures left too few people remembering the original agreement. Talbot, already ill, built the hidden chamber. The documents were sealed there, while duplicate notices were sent to a law office in Wichita and a trust office in Denver that held some of the reserve funds under restricted withdrawal. Eliza read until the light shifted, and her knees ached under her on the loft planks. Then she found the letters that made the whole matter stop being merely historical and become painfully immediate. In a later packet, dated only 9 years before, there were communications from a Denver trust manager requesting the signatures of 3 surviving reserve guarantors to release accumulated funds for drought relief. 2 guarantors had died. The third line, still blank, bore the name of Eliza Wren as acting custodian after Ezekiel Talbot's death. There was no evidence her father had ever received those letters. Another note, in a different hand, returned undelivered, showed the bank had redirected correspondence meant for the cooperative. Eliza sat very still with that page between her fingers. If Kincaid had intercepted letters years ago, then the slow starvation of Mercy Crossing's shared protections had not been neglect alone. It had been managed. He had allowed memory to decay because forgetfulness, once entrenched, could be monetized. Every widow's emergency allotment that depended thereafter on bank approval, every family forced into private debt for water once meant to be common, every acre foreclosed because drought had made a man desperate enough to sign, all of it had ripened under a silence cultivated for profit. The velvet pouch held 23 double eagles and smaller gold pieces, likely meant for immediate emergency use if the reserve was ever reopened. It was a fortune to a woman with $1.35 left. Eliza closed the pouch without counting again. The temptation was plain, almost embarrassingly human. With that gold she could leave Mercy Crossing, go east to relatives she barely knew, rent clean rooms somewhere no one had heard the word thief attached to her name, begin again beneath a different sky. Yet to do that would be to shrink the documents into mere rescue for one person when they described, in patient ink, an obligation far wider. Eliza Wren had taught her that figures are moral things because they reveal where bread, water, and shelter truly flow. Ruth had taught her that one does not turn away from repair simply because too many boards are cracked. And perhaps, though she would not have said it so plainly aloud, Eliza had been so deeply wronged by Mercy Crossing that only the chance to do right by it could restore the part of her that had not yet gone bitter. For 3 days she worked in secrecy. She copied the most important pages in her own hand, noting seals, signatures, and dates. She rewrapped the originals and concealed them again, but not all in the same place. The gold she stitched into a mattress ticking beneath her blanket. The survey map she rolled inside the leg of an old pair of men's trousers found in the tack room. The letters she tucked under the false bottom of her paper box. She also studied the recent ledgers she had salvaged from her own house, and suddenly saw new shapes in them now that the reserve records had sharpened her eye. Charges labeled water maintenance had appeared in accounts where no such maintenance had been performed. Emergency grain purchases supposedly funded by Kincaid's bank corresponded suspiciously with months when the Denver Trust had sent inquiries about reserve release. He had not only buried a common fund, he had replaced it with debt-bearing charity of his own design, and then, when shortages emerged, blamed the most exposed keeper of the books. Once seen, the pattern became almost vulgar in its boldness. But seeing a pattern and proving it to frightened people were not the same labor. She would need corroboration that the outside trust still existed, that the covenant carried legal force, and that the altered courthouse record could be challenged. She began with the telegraph office. Mrs. Halbert, who ran it after her husband's stroke, still looked Eliza in the eye, which in those days counted as a kind of allegiance. Paying with 2 of her precious remaining silver pieces, Eliza sent concise wires to the Denver Trust office named in the letters, and to the Wichita law firm whose predecessor had once received notice of the reserve. She asked whether the Mercy Crossing Common Reserve remained on record and whether any duplicate covenant or correspondence survived. The operator raised a brow but asked no questions. In a town thick with rumor, silence can be nobler than sympathy. Eliza next visited old Abel Sutter, nearly blind now and living in a back room behind the harness shop, because he had been assistant county surveyor in his youth and might know the swallow seal. He remembered it at once. The cooperative, he said, had been the founders' answer to the terror of being one failed reign away from extinction. They had sworn the spring would never become a chokehold in private hands. When Eliza asked why no one spoke of it now, he gave the dry laugh of the very old. Because, he said, The people who remember promises die, and the people who profit from forgetting build the newer story. Word of her movements reached Kincaid sooner than she hoped. On the second evening after her telegraphs, he rode out to the barn alone, immaculate even in dust, his horse stepping high through the burrs as if conscious of better ownership than the pasture deserved. He dismounted and stood just outside the tack room, not entering until invited, which was his way of making civility feel like condescension. He told her he had heard she was troubling old men and sending wires on matters beyond her concern. He observed that ruin sometimes loosens a woman's grasp on proportion. He advised her, with a voice made gentle by practice, not to mistake discarded papers and old grievances for deliverance. Eliza, who had spent too long watching him convert menace into manners, answered only that some papers improve when aged because the lies around them crack first. Something changed in his face then, very little but enough. It was the look of a man who realizes a locked room has been entered though nothing visible has yet been moved. He asked whether she had found anything in the barn. She said she had found exactly what most abandoned places contain: dust, old labor, and what careless men leave behind. He held her gaze a moment longer, then told her the parcel might soon be condemned as unsafe, and if so, she should not expect compensation for improvements. When he rode away, the evening light made his shadow long and thin across the ground, like an ink stroke drawn by a grudging hand. The next morning 2 town boys, red-faced and uneasy, arrived with a notice from the council ordering her to vacate the structure pending inspection. No reason was given beyond hazard and nuisance. That same day, at the Mercantile, she heard herself described as unstable, treasure-mad, and likely to burn the barn for insurance, though everyone in town knew there was no policy on it. Kincaid was moving quickly, which meant he feared more than ridicule. Eliza did not waste time resenting the cowardice of the town. She had already spent too much of her life expecting frightened people to behave bravely by instinct. Instead, she went to the courthouse and requested the original plat books. The clerk, a nervous man who owed his position to Kincaid's endorsement, refused at first, then reluctantly let her see a later copy under supervision. Page numbers skipped where the Western Spring Covenant should have appeared. Yet when she held the paper at an angle to the window light, she saw the faint pressure marks left by writing once on the page above. Common access, drought use, reserve tract. Pencil rubbings, done with the corner of a receipt hidden under her cuff, captured enough impression to compare with the hidden map. It was not elegant evidence, but truth does not always arrive wearing polished boots. By week's end, replies came. The Denver Trust confirmed, in clipped formal language, that an account under the Mercy Crossing Common Reserve remained dormant, substantial with accumulated interest, releasable upon presentation of original founding documents and identity of a lawful local custodian or by court order. The Wichita firm, now much changed in partners but not in storage habits, located a duplicate advisory letter describing concerns about unauthorized transfer attempts involving the reserve and offering to authenticate signatures if originals surfaced. Eliza read those telegrams until the words steadied into certainty. She was no longer merely a woman with suspicious papers in a barn. She was the accidental heir to an interrupted civic promise backed by law, memory, and money. Yet the stakes rose with clarity. If Kincaid learned of the trust before she presented everything at once, he might try to destroy her documents, block the release, or force a private settlement that would preserve his control while appearing generous. Worse, he might accelerate the auction of the spring parcels set for the upcoming Saturday meeting at the church hall, where several indebted families expected to lose the last practical access to water near their kitchen patches. That meeting, she understood, would be her moment, not because a dramatic instinct guided her, but because timing is sometimes the most moral instrument available. Truth spoken too early can be smothered. Truth spoken too late becomes elegy. The morning of the meeting came hard and bright, with heat already lifting off the road in wavering sheets by 8 o'clock. Families arrived in subdued clothes, carrying the silence of people prepared to watch necessity disguise itself as procedure. Mrs. Lanier, whose sons had hauled water for 2 summers from farther east after her husband's leg was crushed, sat near the back with her jaw set. The Ortega brothers stood by the door, hats in hand, smelling of horse and sun. Abel Sutter came in leaning on a cane. Mrs. Halberd took a place along the wall. Kincaid stood near the front table with the sheriff, the clerk, and 2 councilmen, his documents stacked in precise order, his expression one of grave civic burden. He began with a speech about unfortunate defaults, the importance of regularization, and the necessity of transferring underused tracts into productive stewardship. Productive stewardship, in his mouth, meant taking what people had once shared and returning it at interest to the people who had little choice but to borrow. Eliza waited until he named the spring parcel and instructed the clerk to read the transfer. Then she rose from the rear pew, carrying a bundle of papers tied in blue cloth, and walked down the center aisle with such composure that every whisper died before it fully formed. She did not begin by defending herself. That was the first wise thing she did, and perhaps the hardest. Self-vindication can sound selfish even when deserved, whereas forgotten duty, once named, can stir even ashamed hearts. She asked only that the clerk delay the transfer long enough to examine original founding documents relating to the parcel. Kincaid objected at once, calling them unauthenticated materials gathered from abandoned property. Eliza set the survey map on the table, unrolled it beneath the church hall's high windows, and placed beside it the covenant, the reserve ledger, the Denver Trust telegram, and the Wichita confirmation. The swallow seal, dark against old wax, seemed to draw the whole room inward. She spoke then with the clear, measured voice Mercy Crossing had once trusted for inventory tallies and cooperative reports, a voice that made no appeal to pity because it needed none. She described the founder's common reserve, the covenant protecting the spring, the emergency grain and widow provisions, the bonds and deposits left dormant, and the explicit warnings recorded against unauthorized transfer attempts. She named dates. She named witnesses. She named her father as later custodian and showed the redirected correspondence proving notices had been intercepted. Then, because truth must sometimes turn and look directly at injury, she placed beside those papers her copied comparisons from the widow's fund and the bank charges that mirrored the very relief already meant to come from the common reserve. What silenced the room was not simply the existence of hidden wealth, though wealth buried under a hayloft will still the breath of any practical town. It was the moral geometry of the thing. They saw, almost all at once, how the hardships of recent years had not been only weather and bad markets, but also the harvest of deliberate amnesia. Kincaid had prospered not by creating help, but by standing atop help already provided and charging the desperate for access to it. The widow's shortages, the emergency notes, the mortgages against kitchen plots, the pressure on the spring tract, even the accusation against Eliza, all now lay within a pattern old enough to predate the newest drought but sharp enough to wound in the present. Mrs. Lanier began to weep without sound. One of the Ortega brothers said a prayer under his breath in Spanish. Abel Sutter, leaning forward on both hands, told the hall he recognized the signatures and had once helped run the original reserve lines himself. Mrs. Halberd produced the telegraph log, at Eliza's request, showing dates of the confirmations. Kincaid tried to speak about misinterpretation, about clerical confusion over decades, about the impossibility of maintaining archaic common structures under modern financial realities, but the phrases came out thin. He had always depended on people hearing confidence and mistaking it for truth. Now confidence had finally met documentation. The sheriff, who was not a heroic man but disliked finding himself on the wrong side of overwhelming paper, asked Kincaid whether he denied receiving redirected correspondence intended for Eliza Wren. Kincaid said he had handled vast volumes of mail over the years. The answer was fatal because it was neither denial nor explanation. Eliza then unfolded one last sheet, a bank routing note in Kincaid's own younger hand, preserved among the letters, instructing that all Mercy Crossing Reserve communications be held pending clarification of successor authority. Pending had lasted nearly a decade. Quiet moved through the church like a long exhale. Nobody shouted. Nobody needed to. In towns, the truest condemnations are often delivered not in noise but in the rearrangement of esteem. Men who had repeated Kincaid's phrases now would not meet each other's eyes. Women who had believed the worst of Eliza sat with faces turned inward, as if listening to the years they might have lived differently had they questioned sooner. What followed took weeks in law and labor, but the turning happened there. The auction was halted. The council, suddenly eager to appear as guardians of the public good, authorized immediate petition to the county judge. The Denver Trust sent an agent and an auditor. The dormant reserve was recognized, the spring covenant restored, and enough of the accumulated funds released to cover emergency grain, school repairs, ditch clearing, and the redemption of several small household plots wrongfully folded into debt mechanisms dependent on resources that had never rightfully been private. Eliza testified about the altered widow's ledger and helped reconstruct the missing entries from her copies and surviving receipts. The investigation that followed did not produce theatrical arrest on horseback or any other lurid satisfaction the dime novels might have preferred. Instead, it produced the harder, quieter justice that endures. Kincaid lost his position at the bank when the directors in Wichita realized how dangerous his improvisations had become in the light. Claims were filed. His accounts were opened. Several foreclosures were reversed or settled under public scrutiny. The fine house on Main Street, where he had once received petitioners in controlled comfort, was sold to satisfy liabilities. By the first cold wind of autumn, he lived in 2 rented rooms above the feed store, walking daily past men whose hats no longer lifted. As for Eliza, she did what perhaps only a woman of her particular make could have done with sudden legitimacy and access to money. She refused any grand personal allotment beyond restoration of her name, reimbursement for her losses tied directly to the false accusation, and legal title to the barn parcel she had bought for $3. The gold from the velvet pouch she turned over to the reserve as intended, though not before the town tried, awkwardly and with much throat-clearing, to insist she keep more. She would not. Money, she told them, had already been made to do too much lying in Mercy Crossing. Let it tell the truth now. Under her guidance, and with the labor of families who had once avoided her on the boardwalk, the old Talbot barn was repaired instead of torn down. The roof was straightened. The missing window was glazed. New footings were set under the worst lean. The hidden chamber beneath the hayloft was documented and then sealed again, not to conceal wrongdoing now, but to preserve the story of what vigilance had once required. The lower stalls became a reserve granary. The tack room where Eliza had slept was enlarged into a records office for the renewed common fund. A corner of the loft, swept clean and lined with shelves, held school books and maps so children could learn not only arithmetic and spelling, but the history of the water that kept their town alive. When spring returned, ditches ran fuller. Kitchen plots greened behind houses that had nearly emptied. The schoolhouse got a new roof. Widow Lanier's boys planted beans close enough to the spring path that they no longer spent half their strength hauling water. Mrs. Halbert, who had always loved a proper system, helped establish procedures so no single person could ever again intercept all correspondence meant for the reserve. Abel Sutter donated his old field notes. The Ortega brothers repaired the boundary fence without charging for labor. Even the church hall, scene of the revelation, took on a gentler air as though truth once spoken there had widened the room. Eliza worked steadily through it all, not suddenly transformed into some smiling heroine of public imagination, but remaining what she had always been. Exact, composed, sparing with speech, attentive to materials and consequences. Yet Mercy Crossing now saw that those qualities were not coldness. They were forms of care. Children ran messages to the barn and asked to peer up at the hayloft. Women brought preserves and extra cloth without making the gifts sound like repayment. Men who had once laughed at the auction asked her opinion before signing anything important. She did not punish them with her memory, though she did not erase it either. Forgiveness, in her practice, looked less like forgetting than like insisting the future be better organized. And so the line with which her story began changed its meaning without ever becoming false. At 38, Eliza Wren had indeed been homeless, shamed, and nearly emptied of all visible security. She had indeed been called a fool for buying an old barn with money she could scarcely afford to lose. The town's laughter had been real, its suspicion real, its cowardice real. But so too had been the deeper truth hidden beneath the hayloft, waiting in cedar, wax, and careful ink for a pair of hands educated by labor rather than vanity. She had found value where others saw only collapse, because she had been raised among people who measured worth by usefulness, memory, and repair. She had trusted old wood enough to listen when it sounded hollow. She had trusted old paper enough to read it before dismissing it. Most of all, she had trusted that a community, however compromised by fear, could still be recalled to itself if someone laid the evidence before it with patience and without greed. That was the quiet grandeur of what she did. She did not seize a fortune and vanish. She did not use the town's guilt to crown herself above it. She took a hidden inheritance meant for all and returned it to its proper circle, and in doing so restored not only water, grain, and land, but proportion, memory, and moral sight. Mercy Crossing remembered her name differently after that, not with the sour relish that follows scandal, nor with the sentimental excess towns sometimes used to flatter themselves for having once been wrong, but with a steadier respect. Children learned that the reserve barn had belonged to Miss Wren, and older people corrected them softly that it had belonged first to hope, then to neglect, and finally to the woman who would not let either hope or neglect have the last word. If visitors asked how the town had kept going through the lean years that followed, someone would usually point west and mention the spring, the granary, the records in the old barn, and the fact that paper, like timber, must be kept dry and honest if people mean to survive by it. And whenever Eliza climbed to the loft to check the beams or listen to rain on the repaired roof, she would pass over the hidden place where the town's forgotten promise had once slept beneath dust and hay, and she would remember that the world is full of things abandoned before they have told their whole story. So was she for a little while. Yet her name was Eliza Wren, and like the small, determined bird her surname called to mind, she built from scraps, returned in harsh weather, and made shelter where other creatures heard only wind. Thank you for spending this time with us in Mercy Crossing and walking beside Eliza Wren through dust, doubt, and the kind of restoration that begins when one person refuses to look away from what others have written off. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need the reminder that worth is not always loud, new, or properly admired when it first appears. And before you go, tell us this. What is a time you found value in something or someone that others had already dismissed? Until next time, stay close.